Welcome back to News in Focus. Now, tsunami warnings remain in place for New Zealand and Chile a day after an 8.8 magnitude earthquake struck off the coast of the Russian Far East in the early hours of yesterday morning. Authorities in South American countries such as Colombia, Ecuador and Peru had dropped the tsunami alerts. Meanwhile, in the U.S., its Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, said the threat of a major tsunami hitting the United States had, quote-unquote, passed completely. Joining me now, I'd like to welcome Professor Guy Midgley from the University of Stellenbosch School of Climate Studies. Prof. Midgley, thank you so much for joining us here on News in Focus on Hilaal TV.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Prof, I'm looking at, of course, these tsunamis that happen. And of course, this is not a new phenomenon. I mean, you look back to, of course, 2004, the tsunamis that hit Indonesia and, of course, Malaysia at the time. And then, of course, you look to 2011 when that massive earthquake and tsunamis that hit Japan and New Zealand. It just seems as if when we talk of climate change now, it's more a scarier prospect than it was, say, 20 years ago or even as early as 15 years ago.
Well, tsunamis are not a function of climate change. They occur independently of climate change largely. But what's interesting about the tsunami issue is that we've learned a lot about early warning for tsunamis. And we are currently in a state of learning about early warning for climate events. And we are going to have to really learn very fast about how to cope with climate events, extreme events like floods and the longer term events like droughts. But the tsunami watch approach that we now have around the world with buoys that can measure the wave pulses, we've got various listening devices that give us early warnings, is a great example of global cooperation to avoid the worst of these tsunami impacts. But as always, we had to learn through a devastating tsunami impact in order to really bring those systems back up to speed again.
Prof, the Pacific Ocean, I think, is quite a interesting case to understand, especially when tsunamis are happening. I mean, for the viewers out there that are, of course, just understanding tsunamis now, I mean, what makes the Pacific Ocean such a unique case, especially when it comes to these types of phenomena?
Well, the Pacific Ocean is home to what's called the Ring of Fire, which is an area of the world's crust, which is splitting apart around the whole Pacific basin. And these are very long-term changes in the movement of continents that take tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years to happen. But in the process, they create stress and strain in the crust of the Earth. And as those plates move across each other, we, the tiny little animals that we are on the face of the planet, like little ants, are affected by these huge forces that are unleashed as the crustal plates move past each other. It shows how absolutely puny we are in the face of such power in nature.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to agree with you there. I mean, at the end of the day, when you're measuring an earthquake that's 8.8 on the Richter scale, I mean, that in itself just tells you how massive these phenomena are. Prof, you spoke about early warnings and what we have seen, of course, when that earthquake had struck that coast of Russia. Countries like Hawaii, for example, really put on high alert to say, listen, a possibility of it happening, go ahead, try and make sure that your respective authorities can assist in making sure that you are evacuated. And you spoke of the importance of these warnings and the ability to go ahead and track tsunamis. And of course, the 21st century allows for us to happen, but discuss the importance of these early warning signs, and especially in developing countries where it's very difficult to go ahead and make evacuations, how important this is, especially in many South American nations.
Yes. Look, early warning is difficult for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is to get the message across to people early enough and with enough credibility so that they'll act. There's also a lot of fear in calling an early warning where it doesn't happen. And there you can get officials being accused of falsely warning of a disaster to come. And there's a lot of risk in pulling the trigger, so to speak, making the warning. In the case of tsunamis and earthquakes, it's very well understood. So those warnings tend to be quite accurate, just as in the case of many extreme climate events. But there are lots of events where we don't yet know. Earthquakes themselves, we don't know how to make early warnings. There was a dreadful case in Italy around the turn of the century, a few years after the turn of this century, where scientists failed to make an early warning and an entire town was destroyed. And in fact, I think some scientists might even have ended up in jail because they failed to make an early warning, which I think was very unfair. But, you're putting experts in very precarious positions with these early warning systems if the system is not fully reliable. And that's where we rely in the climate space on climate information.
Yeah. Prof, we've come a long way as the globe, haven't we? When speaking of these early warning signs, I mean, we look to obviously at the turn of 2000 when, of course, those floods hit Mozambique. We looked at, of course, those tsunamis that hit the coasts of Malaysia and Indonesia. And then, we look at what happened in Japan and, of course, in New Zealand when that earthquake occurred. And I think that's the positive aspect when you look now at 2025, that when you look at the early warning signs, it allows governments to go ahead and say, listen, we are having plans in place to help evacuate our residents, because at the end of the day, it is the residents, it is the citizens of these countries that are going to be most affected by these phenomena.
Well, I agree. We're very good. We're getting much better at the short-term impacts. And of course, that's where the human brain seems to be focusing on the short term, but we're very bad at assessing the long-term threats like climate change. And so we continue happily, gaily farming, mining coal, burning it and sticking it up in the atmosphere in the vague hope that we're going to get economic growth, but completely ignoring the long-term adverse effects. So we're good at short-term things, but we're terribly bad at long-term warning. And so that part of our brain is not functioning well enough.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. I mean, how many more warnings do we need to receive for there to be the talk of climate change being taken seriously? When you have, of course, the man sitting in the White House who's a big fan of fossil fuels, that's none other than US President Donald Trump. When you have, of course, the United Nations saying, listen, we really need to take this climate change quite seriously. You can have how many COP events occurring, but if the leaders of the world are not going to take it seriously, then what are we doing? And I think that is the warning sign. If what we saw this week is not a warning sign, then Prof, I really don't know what it is. Is the world really still taking climate change seriously, especially the G7 countries and those in the powerful corporations that are still sticking to fossil fuels?
Oh, they are taking it very seriously. It's not so easy getting off fossil fuels. It takes political will, it takes economic will. But who's in charge, really? So it's not only the Trumps of the world that are addicted to fossil fuels. There are people in this country that seem to have a particular liking for fossil fuels. So we shouldn't be casting stones. We ourselves are somewhat guilty.
Yeah, no, definitely, and I couldn't disagree with you there. In South Africa itself, still to take their adoption with regards to how we're going to deal with climate change. Prof. Midgley, absolute pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolute pleasure. That's Professor Guy Midgley. He's from the University of Stellenbosch School of Climate Studies. Well, that's all we have for you here on News in Focus from myself, Hospital, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. If you've missed today's show, you will be able to catch all the interviews on our YouTube channel. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.